On this week's Learn with Mr. Lewis, we'll learn about a secret message that helped push the U.S. into a war, a tragic episode that devolved into cannibalism, history's most famous impromptu concert, and one of America's greatest national tragedies. A quick reminder, if you like what you see here on Learn with Mr. Lewis, please like and subscribe. Let's get to this week's events. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger explodes 73 seconds after liftoff. There is heightened coverage of this mission because of Christa McAuliffe and the Teacher in Space program. McAuliffe is set to teach a lesson to school children from space on the fourth day of the mission. In fact, many kids across the country watched the launch live on TV in their classrooms. The coldest temperature for any shuttle launch had been 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature at launch time on January 28th is just 26 degrees. The booster manufacturer recommended a minimum of 53 degrees, warning that otherwise a catastrophic O-ring failure was possible. That failure causes a massive explosion. The crew apparently survives the initial explosion, but with no mechanism in place for them to eject from the craft, they are killed when they hit the ocean's surface. President Reagan consoles the nation from the White House that night and quotes a poem, saying that the crew has slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. On January 29, 1820, England's King George III dies at age 81. In 1760, he succeeds his grandfather George II as king. He's just 20 years old. Unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, he is born in Britain and speaks English as his first language. His policy of coercion against the American colonies leads to the outbreak of the American War for Independence in 1775. The loss of these 13 North American colonies leads to opposition, but he overcomes this through his appointment of William Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister, who helps George navigate through the turbulent French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. Pitt also engineers the Acts of Union in 1800, which officially established the United Kingdom. For years, George had suffered through bouts of mental illness. By 1810, this mental illness, perhaps caused by a liver disorder, completely overtakes him, and he spends the rest of his life in the care of his wife, Queen Charlotte. His then record 59 years on the throne are surpassed by his granddaughter Victoria, born 8 months before his death. On January 30th, 1969, the Beatles staged their famous rooftop concert in London. In 1968, the Beatles decide they want to try to get back to their roots. See what I did there? They plan to do a live performance of new songs, broadcast it as a TV special, and release it as an album. These songs would need to work well live, without recording tricks, many of which the group and its producer George Martin had pioneered. The band, accompanied by a film crew, begins rehearsing at Twickenham Film Studios on January 2nd, 1969. They later moved to their Apple Corps headquarters. On January 22nd, George Harrison brings in keyboardist Billy Preston. It is unclear who first suggests the idea, but on January 30th, the 42-minute impromptu concert becomes the band's final public performance. They perform 9 takes of 5 new songs as the crowd of onlookers gathers in the streets, leading the police to shut it down. The session and the rooftop concert become the bulk of 2 documentaries, 1970's Let It Be and 2022's Get Back. On January 31st, 1990, the first McDonald's in the Soviet Union opens. Although an American icon, it is actually the CEO of McDonald's Canada who first starts the process by bringing Soviet representatives to a McDonald's during the 1976 Montreal Olympics. But a plan to use McDonald's to feed foreign tourists at the 1980 Moscow Games is scuttled after the U.S. decides to boycott. Years later, Gorbachev agrees to a plan to bring in the fast food chain as part of his push for change. The fact that it is McDonald's Canada gives a neutral touch to the arrangement. Despite the harsh winter weather, an estimated 38,000 people wait in hours-long lines in Pushkin Square to be served on opening day. One woman said that when she took her first bite, she felt like she was eating America itself. The opening of this capitalist icon signals the impending fall of the USSR, which occurs less than 2 years later. By 1997, there are 21 locations in Russia, and by 2020, 700. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, McDonald's and many other Western businesses leave Russia. On February 1, 1790, the U.S. Supreme Court meets for the first time. The court is established by Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, which takes effect in 1789. The Judiciary Act of 1789 provides for 6 justices who would serve for life. George Washington appoints John Jay of New York as Chief Justice. The other 5 are chosen from across the new country. Today, a seat on the court is both powerful and prestigious, but it wasn't always that way. Although Jay is famous for being the first Chief Justice, he doesn't stay long, resigning in 1795 to become New York's governor. In fact, Washington has trouble keeping the court fully stocked and is forced to appoint 3 more Chief Justices after Jay. On his way out of office, second President John Adams appoints his Secretary of State, John Marshall, as Chief Justice, and it changes everything. Marshall makes the court a force. He fully establishes the court's power of judicial review, the power to declare laws unconstitutional. He serves as Chief Justice for 34 years, transforming the judiciary into a truly co-equal branch of government. On February 2nd, 1847, the first member of the Donner Party dies in the Sierra Nevada. A group of 87 people joins up in South Pass, Wyoming, to make the final leg of the trip to California. Most were farmers with little experience with wilderness travel. Two large families, the Donners and Reeds, are at the heart of the group, with George Donner as the unofficial leader. They don't leave Wyoming until October 27, 1846. They elect to take an unproven shortcut known as Hastings Cutoff through the yet unsettled Salt Lake Valley. This forces them to hack their way through the canyons of the Wasatch Mountains and trek across the barren Great Salt Lake Desert, wasting precious time. Once they reach the Sierras, the snow hits hard, forcing them to camp near a small lake north of Lake Tahoe. About half the group dies from cold and starvation, and the others are forced to eat their fallen companions to survive. 15 brave men trek through the snow 100 miles to Sutter's Fort, where a rescue party is sent to save the survivors. On February 3, 1917, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson cuts off relations with Germany as a result of the Zimmermann telegram. When World War I begins in 1914, the U.S. takes a position of neutrality, but supports the Allies through trade. Conversely, Britain's naval blockade of Germany brings immense hardship to the Germans. But by 1917, U.S. entry into the war seems inevitable. Germany implements a plan to counter that inevitability. Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sends a telegram to Heinrich von Eckhardt, German ambassador to Mexico. The instructions: if the U.S. enters the war, von Eckhardt should approach Mexico's president with an offer of alliance. Germany would provide weapons and money for Mexico to attack the U.S. to reacquire land lost in the Mexican-American War back in 1848. Additionally, von Eckhardt should use the Mexicans as an intermediary to entice Japan into the alliance. The British intercept and decode the message and inform Wilson, causing him to cut off relations. When it's made public weeks later, Americans are outraged. Another interesting note about the Zimmermann telegram: when it's made public, both Mexico and Japan make it very clear that they have no interest whatsoever in this proposed alliance. Japan, in fact, was a member of the Allies, although they do, at the end of the war, end up extremely unhappy with the treaties that are signed at the end of the war, including the Treaty of Versailles. With the Donner Party, if you're ever driving on I-80 through the Sierra Nevadas, you really should take some time and stop and see the memorial there, the museum. It's really amazing. Donner Lake is beautiful. There's this amazing statue that they have that is the base is the same height as the snow was that winter. It's really cool to see. And it's I don't know what it is, 20 feet up or something. It's crazy. Anyway, the Russian McDonald's thing. So there's this knockoff Russian version of McDonald's that's taken over. And they have taken over some of the locations, including that original one at Pushkin Square. So there is a McDonald's-esque company still in Russia, but it's not the original, of course. The Beatles. My favorite scene of the Get Back documentary, which if you haven't seen it, you really need to see it. It's when they're actually like jamming and writing the song Get Back, and you see that creative process. John's not even there at the beginning. It's early in the morning, and then John shows up like partway through. And anyway, I'll put a link in the description to a clip of that. It's not the whole segment that you get in the full documentary, but it is still interesting to see. Those Hamilton fans out there, of course, you love King George. He doesn't have a huge part in the musical, but his 3 songs are 3 of the highlights of Hamilton for sure. And finally, the Challenger. Dick Scobie, the commander of the mission, told his wife the night before that he expected they were going to cancel the launch. It was just going to be too cold. And then that next morning, when he tells his wife that it's a go, she's like, but how is that possible? And he's like, no, they've assured us everything's good. They've knocked the icicles off. We're good. It's just such a tragic situation. But Reagan's speech is absolutely amazing. I'll put a link to that in the description. His speech is just powerful. And the poem that he quotes is from a man named John Gillespie Magee. The poem is called High Flight. He was a 19-year-old American who had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force as a fighter pilot because the U.S. wasn't in the war yet, and he wanted to do something. And he wrote a letter to his parents from England This is all during World War II. And then he dies just a few months after sending the letter on December 11th, 1941. Testing, testing, testing. Challenger explodes. 8th, 1980. I have the wrong date written here. Never mind. King George III. And he spends... no, I did that all wrong. Said that all wrong. Their rooftop... George Martin. Why do I keep saying that? Donner. Okay, let's try that again. Second. 27th. Benevitability, and then it's like a tongue twister. Soft diplomatic relaciones.